Mass shootings and gun violence seem to have become a part of life in the United States. So far this year, there have been over 360 mass shootings reported and some 25,000 people who've died due to any form of gun violence, according to the Gun Violence Archive. Gun purchases are also soaring, despite Americans already owning more guns than their population. Following a series of shootings this summer, U.S. President Joe Biden signed into law of what some call one of the most significant gun control bills over the past 30 years, but others say is simply not enough. How to understand the root causes around gun control in America? What more has to be done? Welcome to a special series focusing on America's three big society woes. Joining me today from Williamsburg, Virginia is Dr. Robert Spitzer, Distinguished Service Professor and Emeritus from Political Science Department at the State University of New York College at Cortland. From Beijing, Victor Gao, Chair Professor at Suzhou University, and from Philadelphia, Brandon Blackburn-Dwyer, President of the consulting firm Grasshopper Strategies. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. Dr. Spitzer, let me go first to you. As we know, so far this year, the U.S. has recorded over 25,000 deaths of gun violence. That's including deaths of all causes, and over 350 mass shootings, over 3,000 children and teenagers have been killed or injured as a result of gun violence. What explains the quickly worsening situation on gun violence in the United States? Is there a gap between these numbers and people's experience when living there?
Well, there are several factors that explain this rise in gun violence in America. The backdrop to this is the fact that for about almost the last 30 years, crime in every category, including violent crime and gun crime, has been gradually declining. But in the last few years, it started to increase. And that happened partly around the pandemic period. Even though people were not out on the streets, people were home more often. There was a rise in domestic violence, a rise in economic insecurity, in fear. There have been demonstrations around the country in the last few years, and those have been hyped in a way to scare people to some degree. And we have seen, as you're suggesting, a large number of Americans going out and buying guns and increasing the total number of guns. And of course, you can't have gun violence without firearms. And we're a nation that owns a great many firearms anyway. But this recent increase in firearm circulation in the country has predictably led to the count that you just described of gun suicides, gun homicides, and then accidental deaths from guns. And we've also seen an increase in mass shootings. And as terrible as they are, it's important to point out that mass shootings represent a very small proportion of all gun deaths every year, about 1%. It's a serious problem, and there's much more that can be done. And Congress and the president did take a step to address this problem last month.
Let's take a look at the step that the Congress took. Victor, if you agree with the president, if you agree with Dr. Spitzer's laying out of the background of the context of the situation, and also about this bill, the bill expands background checks on people between ages of 18 and 21 seeking to buy a gun. It includes incentives for states to pass so-called red flag laws that allow groups to petition courts to remove weapons from people deemed a threat to themselves or others. It also expands an existing law that prevents people convicted of domestic abuse from owning a gun to include dating partners rather than just spouses or former spouses. Do you think these will significantly reduce gun violence effectively?
Well, first of all, this bill to expand background checks for gun buyers is a necessary step, but it is definitely not sufficient. At best, I'm afraid it is whitewashing the root causes of the gun violence in the United States. I think the United States really stands out not only among developed countries, but throughout the world in terms of the gun violence. And even up to today, the United States government, agencies, federal government, state governments, you name it, still refuse to address the fundamental causes of the gun violence, which has resulted in so many lives being taken away in the United States. In a sense, the worst enemy of the United States do not exist outside of the United States. They exist inside the United States.
What do you think are or is the biggest root cause?
Well, I think if we go back all the way to 1791, when the Second Amendment was enacted, we need to ask one fundamental question. At that time, who could really own a gun? It's not the African Americans, they were enslaved, and they were not American Indians. They were the enemies to be wiped out, and eventually genocide was committed to eliminate the American Indians. They probably were not even females, because the females in the United States at that time did not have guns. So you are talking about a small group of white male who owned guns at that time. And they own guns for what purposes? They own guns to kill the American Indians and enslave the Afro-Americans, and then to deprive the American ladies of their political rights. This is the real root cause of the gun violence in the United States. And I'm very sorry that for more than 200 years, this origin of the gun violence in the United States has not been fully addressed. And the legacy is spreading out like wildfire, because right now, more people can own guns in the United States, and those who commit gun violence with guns, they own or they don't own, even include teenagers or even younger people. So you are talking about a country owning guns, committing violence, taking away people's lives, and you are talking about really protecting the human rights of the American people without life, or with your life to be wantonly taken away. What are the human rights you are talking about?
Brendan, I want to get your reaction on what Victor just said, addressing what he believes is the biggest root cause, white supremacy or racism, and then this old, fundamental idea spreading in the society with, widespread gun ownership leading to the problem we're seeing now.
The problem with the discussion about guns in America, I think, is that it's a bit of a Rorschach test. No matter what you want to see in this problem, you can find an argument to say that this is the root cause. Is it white supremacy based on gun ownership being predominantly white for 150 to 180 years in American history? Potentially. Is that same element of ownership and wealth inequality and that the legacy of racism and civil rights in America? Is that part of the reason we see, violence rising in the United States as wealth inequality is on the rise? Probably. Is it about mental health? Is it about the youth of America? Is it about video games like we were yelling about in the 80s and 90s? This issue is so complex that it is yes to all of those and no to all of those at the same time. Largely when we're talking about gun violence, we need to really think about what context are we saying it from. Are we talking about the rise of violent crime in the United States, the reversal of 30 years of a decline in violent crime in the United States that has seemingly come wildly shocking to most policymakers in the last 3 to 5 years in America, fueled in part by the COVID lockdown? That's a big change. But that's where we see a lot of violent crime. We need to figure out how to solve that. Mass shooting, which my colleague already pointed out is less than 1% of the problem. That's sort of its own unique problem, right? Those mass shootings aren't being driven by wealth inequality. They're being driven by fringe ideas and people with mental health issues and very sort of isolated extreme elements that it's very hard to make a blanket rule to stop that, because a blanket rule to stop 1% of a problem isn't going to address the other 99% by definition, right? So if you're stopping 1%, you're not stopping the other 99%. So when we're talking about guns in America, it's a complex, multifaceted problem that the Safer Communities Act addressed pieces of it, and it's a breakthrough that the American government was able to address pieces of this problem since it's been 30 years since we've had any major legislation addressing any part of guns in America, but it's by far not enough. It's not targeted enough, and it's only going to go after certain elements of a wildly complex problem.
Dr. Spitzer, while signing the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act into law, Biden said that while this bill doesn't do everything I want, it does include actions I've long called for that are going to save lives. It's been called, as our guest pointed out, the biggest breakthrough in 30 years. But 2 days before the bill, the Supreme Court of the United States also nullified New York law, which prohibited the carrying of firearms outside of the home. Some have called this Congress versus court. How much is the effect of the bill being compromised by such court rulings, if at all, in your eyes?
Well, there is reason to believe that the Supreme Court, in a sharp, going in an opposite direction of what most of the country wants to see and what Congress and the President recently signed off on, the Supreme Court said in this recent decision that the Second Amendment, for the first time in history, now gives citizens a right to carry guns with them for personal protection outside of the home. And by the way, the Second Amendment only was defined as a personal right since 2008. For 200 years, the Second Amendment was defined in the way it was written. That is to say, it protected the right of states to form well-regulated militias in order for states to protect themselves from manifold threats from the British, the French, from Native Americans, to be sure, because that was our primary military point of view. Other point related about this, there were thousands of gun laws early in American history. In fact, from my own research, in our first 300 years, in many respects, guns were more heavily regulated than in the last 30 years in our country. And we've seen, most recently, the Supreme Court going in the opposite direction by widening the definition of gun rights. And that does indeed open the door to invite new legal challenges to gun laws, including perhaps this new federal law that have been upheld in the past in legal challenges, but that may now find themselves being struck down by this new widening of gun rights. And I think it is a problem that the court has issued a decision of this nature, and for a lot of reasons.
Victor, I do have this question here. I mean, the Constitution was drafted hundreds of years ago, but the situation keeps changing, right? New circumstances, economy is different, society is different, the definition of rights different, challenges are different. How come the American system has not been able to address the changing challenges, and always use that that piece of stone set many decades ago to guide how you behave today?
Well, first of all, I think
yeah, go ahead, Victor, please.
Yeah, first of all, I think the constitutional grant of right to citizens to own guns was based on the wrong premise to start with back in the 19th century. And now we are in the 21st century, and the world we are living in is completely different. The United States is also very different compared with more than 200 years ago. And talking about the guns, you are not only talking about the shotguns, you are talking about automatic rifles, which are more lethal than anything that the constitutional drafters could have imagined more than 200 years ago. And I think there are lots of vested interests in the United States who want to protect their own provincial interests rather than to give consideration to the overall interests of the whole nation in the United States.
All right.
And as a result, innocent people lose their life.
Yeah. Dr. Spitzer, really briefly, please, what did you wanted to add? 30 seconds, please.
Well, I was just going to make the point that historically the Constitution has been adapted to changing circumstances, but there is a prevailing conservative philosophy that has a majority of the U.S. Supreme Court that argues for originalism, which to me is a bankrupt concept that says indeed that you need to look back 200 years to decide how to solve contemporary problems, and it is an utterly inadequate way to address contemporary problems.
So sorry, we have to leave it there. Time is extremely limited. Many thanks, Dr. Robert Spitzer from University of New York College at Cortland, Victor Gao from Suzhou University, and Brendan Blackman-Dwyer from Grasshopper Strategies.